It is a wonderful honor to welcome Professor Claude Fischer to this interview at this podcast. He is the professor of sociology at the University of California, Berkeley. And today we're discussing his wonderful book, Made in America, A Social History of American Culture and Character. How are you today, Claude? Thank you for joining us.
I'm fine, thank you.
I should say that I'm doing a master's degree in American Studies now, and one of my courses primarily features your book as study material. So I think this will be a helpful supplement to that.
Terrific. Glad to hear that.
I should like to begin by asking you, do the average American see themselves as exceptional?
Well, let's put it this way. Average Americans, if we think about the people who are interviewed in surveys, tend to think of America as exceptional in the sense that they think America is better and best in just about every way. Even those who may be depressed a bit about current circumstances or uneasy about current circumstances, I think endorse that rhetoric of this is the greatest country and so forth and so on. And I think a lot of them falsely assume that on any metrics you might want having to do with well-being or freedom or whatever, that America is the best. Yeah, I do think the word exceptional is used not so much by average Americans, but by opinion leaders in America. And that is certainly a very common theme.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, just a footnote on that, back when Barack Obama was running for president, or was president, I forget which election it was, he was criticized because he had not wholeheartedly endorsed the idea that America was exceptional. And he had to do a little backtracking and say, of course he believes America is exceptional.
Mm-hmm. Yes. I wonder if President Obama sees that the fact that he is elected as a Black man made, the country exceptional at least in some way, shape, or form.
Yes, and I think he and many people around him saw the election by itself as a sort of historical transformation. And I think one must say, of course, that it was an important historical marker. I think many people are aware now that in many ways it was a limited success, partly because issues of race and inequality persist, and partly because his very election stimulated a lot of reaction, negative reaction. So one could do, if you're looking for a master's thesis or a doctoral thesis, could do a interesting comparison of the enthusiasm and optimism around his election, and then the mood 8 years later after people realized we had not reached the promised land.
I see. Well, you are giving me some ideas, so I might use them. So thank you very much. Yeah, so I do know that there's a sociologist, Seymour Martin Lipset, who defines American exceptionalism as not that America is better than other countries at certain things, but that it is founded differently. It has a different conception of itself. To what extent do you believe that to be the case?
I do, and let me talk about the Lipset argument about the sort of creedal, C-R-E-D-A-L, creedal nature of America in a minute. But I do want to say, just to close out that conversation about the word exceptional, I do think that social scientists such as myself or Seymour Martin Lipset mean exceptional in the sense of unusual, very unusual. I think most Americans, and certainly American politicians who like to use the term, mean the word exceptional as in most excellent, the best. But we, the social scientists, really think of it in terms of America being an outlier. an unusual case. Okay, Seymour Martin Lipset, who was a very eminent sociologist of the 1950s and 1960s, and did a lot of wonderful work. But he wrote a couple of books that had to deal, a few books, I think, that had to deal with the fundamental nature of American culture, American society. One of his books involved comparisons to Canada. He was also an expert on Canadian society. And his argument, and the argument of others as well, is that one of the key distinctions of the United States, it may share it with a few other countries, but what clearly distinguishes it from old Europe, let's say, France, Germany, Scandinavia, Italy, and what distinguished it from most nation states that were developing in the world in the 1950s and 60s, is that the central core of identity was not about a peoplehood, or in contemporary terms, an ethnic identity, in the way that, let's say, France is very much tied up with the nature of being French, or Russia with a culture around Moscow or Leningrad as the sort of identifying nature, and a lot of modern states, that is newly created states, being clearly identified with a particular tribal or ethnic group or religious group. I mean, many states around the world have religious emblems on their flags, a cross, a crescent, and so forth. Instead, the distinction in the United States, in his and others' minds, is that the central core was signing on to and agreeing to a set of beliefs about the nature of civil society, a belief in democracy, a belief in human freedom, a belief in individual rights, and that this is what made Americans distinctive, that citizenship, not only formal citizenship, but cultural acceptance, entailed agreeing to these set of creeds. And then it didn't matter whether your ancestry was from Wales or Sweden or Tuscany. And in the early part of the American society, those are big differences, the differences between somebody from Wales and somebody from Sweden or somebody from Tuscany. It didn't matter if everybody signed up on to this creedal idea. Now, this is all an ideal. Obviously, in real lived life, issues of racial backgrounds, religious differences always occur. But the argument is that the core of citizenship is this creedal endorsement. And that continues, by the way, to be a source of conflict in the United States, the extent to which people believe that's what it means to be an American.
I see. Yes. I believe it was Samuel Huntington's final work, Who Are We? He challenges directly this notion that America's a creedal nation. He doesn't say that it is false. He said that it is partly true. And the second part, or the other parts he cites, is the fact that America began as an Anglo-Protestant nation. And I believe he believes that is truer to understanding the American character. So with that, how would you examine that argument of his?
Well, I think this is a very interesting paradox, because it is true, and I argue in my book in great detail, that the culture of American society and much of its notions about character are adopted from Anglo-Protestant heritage. Everything from, well, I should say, to be more precise, Anglo-dissident Protestantism, not the Anglican Church, though it was prominent in the United States, but the driving force are the dissident Protestants who left England, landed in New England, and came to have a tremendously outsized influence on the development of American culture. So on the one hand, I would agree that if you want to understand what makes Americans different, the first place to start is to understand this dissident Protestant heritage manifested in all sorts of ways across parts of American society. And it's so powerful that the underlying themes of that culture are quickly adopted by peoples who've come to the United States from all corners of the world. If you want, I can give you an example I've used in teaching undergraduates. But at the same time, part of that creed are these political ideas that were fomenting around the same time as the settlement of North America. These ideas, again, out of England, Lockean ideas about the nature of a restrained sovereign, voice of the people, individuality and individual rights, such that, and this is the paradox, this ideology, this American creed, didn't come out of nowhere, and it didn't come out of some United Nations assembly and negotiation. It came out of that Anglo-Protestant culture itself. But it meant that down the line, that culture, that society was, at least in principle, sometimes not in practice, but at least in principle, wedded to the idea that whoever came, or whatever anybody's ancestry was, as long as they were willing to accept the principles of this country, were equal citizens. So I'm not that familiar with Huntington's work, but I think this creedal insistence here has had a long influence in the United States in making it relatively accepting of peoples from other parts of the world. And as if you compare that experience to other countries, relatively accepting of other peoples of the world, and it tremendously assimilating. In the sense that by third generation, most immigrants no longer know their native tongue that they came with, and they are, as far as they're concerned, just Americans.
Right. Yeah. Another one of these ideals is the melting pot, which you've alluded to earlier, which states that immigrants, as long as they become more Americans, can be accepted as equal citizens. But I'd like to refer to another great sociological study, Beyond the Melting Pot, by Glaser and Moynihan, where they examined the 5 ethnic groups of...
I'm going to get rid of this phone call, just a moment. Sorry.
So as I was saying, Beyond the Melting Pot by Glaser and Moynihan, in which they examined the 5 ethnic groups of New York City, and they find that they're likely to retain their ethnic identities, even when they are intermingling with the other ethnic groups. And in many ways, they have largely failed, so to speak, to adopt the American creed. So I wonder if is it the case that Americans' belief in the melting pot narrative increases the chances of the melting pot narrative becoming reality, and then vice versa, or is the narrative in itself true?
Well, I know that book very well. When I was roughly at your stage in my career, I read it very closely, and I had both Glaser and Moynihan as instructors at some point. So I think that book was written in the 1960s, based basically on research and understanding of the 1950s. And the 1950s were basically one generation after the cessation of the great immigration waves from Europe. And let's say 2 generations removed from the peak of immigration from places like Italy and Eastern Europe. So I think the message of the melting pot today, now we're about 60 years later than that, is that the erasure of ethnic differences took longer than some expected. And and its traces could be seen 2 generations down. But if you now come 3 or 4 generations after the Great Migration, the storyline changes a lot. Let's take New York. With the major exception of the Black population, that is always the major exception to a lot of things we say about America. It's a special case, the descendants of American slaves. But for the other cases in their book, the Irish, the Italian, the Jews, the Puerto Ricans, for the most part, if Glaser and Moynihan were here to redo that book, they would see that those have dissipated. There's much less difference between the Italians and the Irish and the Jews than they described then. Now, New York still has a place of great influx. So they might write a book today that would be about the Dominicans and the Chinese as they are increasing numbers and are still in their first, second generations of immigration. So that's one thing. This is a matter of time. I think they were struck in the 1950s and 60s by how distinctive the Italians and the Irish seem to still be, but you couldn't say that anymore. Okay, it's just we've gone down that road. And the second thing about the melting pot. So the metaphor of the melting pot, which comes, as you probably know, out of or was popularized by a play of the early 1900s, implies that everybody is blended in together equally. The Canadians like to use the phrase in a salad bowl, in which people are not so blended, the little pieces remain distinctive. But I'm not sure either is a good metaphor, because when I talk about assimilation, it's quite clear the direction in which people assimilate is to this classic Anglo-American Protestant model. And much of what remains of these earlier waves of immigrants, like the Italians and the Irish, is reduced to tokens and sentimentalism. President Biden often likes to talk about his Irish heritage, but I'm not sure that his behavior is shaped by his Irish heritage in any particular way. So it's really the melting pot, which implies that all these pieces, these ingredients would be blended together equally. I think that's wrong. I think it's assimilation to a particular standard. And if you wish, I'll give you the example I use in my undergraduate class.
No, please do.
So we have this system in the United States we've had for many, many generations, in which people marry on the basis of love. And the model is that 2 young people will meet each other, will decide whether they love one another, and then decide to get married. Now, in world historical perspective, this is an extremely weird idea. In fact, in many ways, an impractical, unwise way to arrange marriages. But this is the form of marriage that developed in England and accentuated in the United States in the early 19th century. And what struck me when I was teaching at Berkeley, I don't do much teaching anymore, but when I was teaching at Berkeley, is we would get students from all over the world. Students from Asia, Eastern Asia, a lot of students from Southern Asia, students from Africa, the Middle East. These were young people who were coming from cultures that did not have this individual love, individual choice idea of marriage, but cultures of arranged marriages, much more sensible from a sociologist's point of view. And yet, those children in my class, those young people in my class, who either themselves were immigrants or whose parents had arrived maybe 10 years before they were born, were all sold on this model. They all accepted this idea that the way that one gets married is by finding, as individuals, finding another individual who you are in harmony with, and you should marry that way, just like Romeo and Juliet, but live happily ever after, unlike Romeo and Juliet. And their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents considered this to be bizarre. Now, I know this model of romantic love marriages is now spread around the world a lot more. That is, it's part of sort of American cultural hegemony. But it is very, in my mind, striking that it is very difficult for anybody in the United States to do arranged marriages. Their children revolt, the neighbors revolt, people report them to the police. I mean, but even without the coercion from outside, their children are now in a totally different place. So that's my example of it's not melting so much as adopting this what I call voluntaristic model of society.
So to connect Romeo and Juliet with ethnic conflict in New York, we have West Side Story, of course.
That's right. That's right.
Yes. I think there's the inherent conflict or the inherent root of all conflicts that I see as an outsider in American society is to what extent where should we place the founding, so to speak, of the American character, not the formal United States of America itself? Well, should we place it in the early 17th century with the Pilgrims and the Mayflowers, or should we place it in the 18th century during the Revolution? Because those two populations, the founders and the Pilgrims, represented widely different views of what the American character should be. One is firmly rooted in Anglo dissident Protestantism, and the other is, well, Enlightenment republicanism.
I think that's terrific observation. I mean, I think it's a very good question, and requires much more nuanced analysis. I would even sharpen it a little bit by saying the original Pilgrims and the original dissident Protestants believed in a much more authoritarian society, a rule by the saints, quote unquote, which effectively meant the elders of the church, while the core ideologues of the American Revolution were anti-authoritarian and believers in radical egalitarianism, at least for white people, radical egalitarianism. If you think of an ideologue like Thomas Paine, and the sort of ideas written into the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal, etc. But I do think actually that there is a line there, and I think the founding fathers, that generation that laid out the sort of political theory of the country, and so Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Thomas Paine, and so forth, who read Locke and Hobbes and so forth. The impulse, I think, on the American continent was very much pushed by the evolution, I think, of Protestant ideas. So inherent in the dissident Protestantism, and in some ways not fully appreciated by their own leaders, was the idea that the ultimate connection between the individual and God is individual, is not through a hierarchy. Heaven, from their point of view, heaven forbid a structure like the Roman Catholic Church. Even the Anglican Church was much too imposed too much of interference between the individual and God. And that radical individualism in the religious sphere was inherent in dissident Protestantism. And you can see it develop in the early days with schisms within those Protestant churches, with a crisis that many of the New England churches faced, which was people moving out of the villages. So they started with these enclosed villages, heavily structured. If there were people in the villages who were not members of the church, they were sort of a secondary, tertiary population. The old form of agriculture, which is a form of agriculture in most places in the world, is people live in these villages and they go out to their fields and then they come back. But you get in America development of these homesteading things where people move their residences out to the fields and they build a home near the fields. This led to this sort of dispersal of members of the church and people setting up their own churches in contradistinction to the church that was set up originally. And that's one sort of self-defeating mechanism, that these were righteous. I mean, that is the dissonance to the dissident churches could claim the right to form their own churches. Another factor was the insistence on literacy, biblical literacy, which was founded on the idea, again, that each individual is supposed to make his or her connection to God. Led to a lot of people coming up with all sorts of idiosyncratic and individual takes on religion. And I think that you see in what happens, let's say, the pre-revolutionary era is what was for many of the leaders of the early Pilgrims and the early New England Protestants in particular, but this was true, I think, many places in the colonies, is a claim that we hear over and over again in writings about American history, which is the decline of the community. And they meant, very concretely, the establishment of these other churches, the establishment of these sectarian competition, despite efforts to suppress them. So the way I think about it is that these were the roots of individual dissent and individuals coming together in alternative communities, which fed the ideas of the founders. So I don't see them really in contradiction. By the time the founders are active, a lot of the strong handhold over the church members that the original Pilgrim Fathers had long weakened. They had to make compromises with this insistence on individual choice, individual community formation, voluntary community formation.
So you brought up the topic of community, which I find very fascinating. Of course, there have been a long line of literature written by American scholars about either community or the lack thereof in American society, from The Quest for Community by Robert Nisbet to Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam. But the way I see it, there's a certain change in meaning in how Americans view the word community. It becomes from the idea of a localized area to something more abstract, like a collection of people who share the same like identity characteristic. For example, the Black community or the LGBT plus community. So how do you account for, so to speak, this change in meaning?
Well, how do I think about this? I'm just the extent to which the word community was applied to local places. And actually, you may be aware, there's at least one book or more that's just a study of the use of the term over time, cataloging all the different ways the word community has been used. And then there's the influence of sort of foreign terms for this, like Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft, that way that's affected the thinking. So let me say two different kinds of answers. One will be about the issue of geography and community, and the other more abstractly about community. I think the notion of community in the American context, despite the overlap with locality, has largely entailed a notion of voluntary subscription to a set of concerns, interests, or principles. So to get back to those 17th century New England villages, there was the community of saints, which is to say, those people living in the community who were full members of the local Protestant church, Pilgrim Church, usually because they had gone through some kind of what we now call born-again event. But there were also other people around in the locality who were in the local community, they were in the township, and had to be dealt with. sometimes cared for, sometimes controlled, sometimes banished. But I think the word community in its more powerful sense and strict sense has always entailed the idea of some kind of shared commitment, not just beyond the shared locality. Okay, and I think that would apply retroactively as well. Now, the other track is the extent to which people have community or communities, plural. How much are they fixed in place? And in an earlier historical era, I think, would answer a lot, fixed in place a lot. The extent to which people's daily round of life was circumscribed to a relatively narrow radius. The community that they shared in the sense of, let's say, their religious community, the community they shared in the sense of their voluntary associations, the community they shared in terms of political responsibility overlapped a lot, and they were very localized. And late 20th century, 21st century America has a some ways paradoxical relationship with this geography, which is that people are more rooted in their localities than ever. This is something that I tell people this, and an hour later they've forgotten it because it doesn't make any sense to them, but it's true. Americans are more rooted in their localities than ever, but their communities of interest and communities of affiliation transcend geography much more. And that would include everything from their work community, the people who share either work together with them or share their kind of work, are located in some place they might have to drive 10 or 15 miles to do their work, or they may be a professional like you and I have a community of interest that spans the globe. And that was much less common, not unknown, but much less common 300 years ago. Much more common for more people these days that they may have a community of interest that is not isomorphic identical to the physical geographical locality in which they live. Is that what you were looking for in terms of the answer?
Yes, I think so. When Alexis de Tocqueville came to America, he certainly find the communitarian aspect, so to speak, more appealing than the individualistic aspect. He had some very harsh things to say when it comes to individualism. But nevertheless, Americans are a nation of movers. I think it's not unusual for an American individual or family to take up and move from one state to the other, which shows that the fact that there are voluntary community means that people have some form of individual choice in what kind of community or communities they prefer to associate with. And I believe that you wrote in your book as well that Americans are, well, both individualistic and communitarian. So to what extent has American society been able to reconcile these two strands of ideas?
Okay, so again, an excellent question. So America is part of the sort of Western, particularly Anglo world in which what we call individualism, arose in the modern era. I always think of it as America is sort of like those other Anglo societies and Western European societies, only much more extreme. But what I've argued in my book is it is combined with a commitment to community or association, and this is what Tocqueville wrote a lot about, was the associational life in the United States. Much committed to that, so long as the community is a voluntary community, it's a voluntary association. So the key factor, I argue, is, or the way I describe it in the book is, Americans are joiners. That's also been a stereotype about Americans. And they are, when we look at them, as committed to groups or communities they belong to as other people are. But there's a very important proviso, which is it has to be a matter of free choice. So in the wide span of human history, the overwhelming number of communities that people have belonged to are communities of fate that are determined for them. They are communities in which they're born into, basically. And there isn't much freedom to leave those communities. But the American community is a community in which the idea is that any day you can get up and decide you want to be something else. You want to be a different member of a different community. And not only do you have for the most part, there's some interesting exceptions, but for the most part, not only do you have the power and the idea of choice that you could say, you could wake up this morning and say, I'm tired of being a Protestant, I want to be a Catholic. I'm tired of being a member of this residential community. I want to be a member of a different residential community. I'm tired of emphasizing my Italian heritage. From now on, I'm going to emphasize my Irish heritage. These are choices that are, again, world historical perspective, are not available to many people. But the other part of it is those choices are accepted by the people around you. And residential mobility is an interesting example. I mean, in fact, Americans are not moving very much anymore, but that also is a reflection of their increasing choice. But a not untypical pattern for Americans is to be in a residential community in a neighborhood and involve themselves in that neighborhood. And then to move somewhere else if, for instance, they are able to afford a much larger home or they get another job. And the people that they are leaving behind do not, they certainly don't have the cultural permission to criticize them as traitors. That is, it is understood. They chose to be members of this voluntary community and involve themselves. And then when it no longer is the optimal, they can choose to be members of another one. And so that's community with an emphasis on individual freedom to enter and exit. And again, in a wider historical perspective, that's unusual. It's more common in the West, and it's taken to its extreme form in the United States.
I found the adjective or the pejorative un-American to be quite intriguing because if you take the same form of adjective applied to other nations, like, well, when I say something like you're un-Japanese, that would not be an insult because, well, you're not Japanese. But when somebody says to you like you're un-American, you cannot really use the fact that you were born and raised within American soil to justify your Americanness. You know, it was the pejorative that Senator McCarthy used against alleged communist sympathizers, and now history used it against him. So it goes back to the idea that being an American means that you stand for a certain set of principles, and that is the fact that you are born in the country is, I suppose, of secondary importance.
Yes, so let me say that this is a matter of considerable debate. There's some empirical research that asks people in various countries what is critical, what is important for a person's identity as a Frenchman, as an Italian. I forget what the countries were. One of the countries was the United States. Is it, for example, speaking the language? Is it being born in that place? Is it having a particular religion? And for the most part, if I remember the data right, the Americans are on outliers as saying none of those things matter as much as endorsing a set of beliefs. Within the United States, this is, I would say, again, the historically, culturally dominant thing, but it's still contested. So we are currently facing, for example, a rise in the number of people who are going to insist that to be American, you have to speak English. To be American, you have to be white. To be American, you have to be Christian. The race thing, they don't want to emphasize that much, but being Christian, native born, and English speaking is what defines you as an American. But that's still the minor themes. I mean, there are people who would like to enthrone that. But the phrase un-American in the common usage is either you're working against American interests, like you're a spy for another country, that's un-American, but basically that you are violating certain principles. Trying to shut people up and not let them speak their mind is un-American. Trying to corrupt the political system is un-American. That's the usual way in which it's applied. And I don't know whether people from other countries have been charged with being un-American. That doesn't seem to make much sense. But I think that still remains, I think, the dominant use of the term here. That is, most Americans would not accuse somebody who's speaking Spanish on the street as being un-American because they spoke Spanish. There would be some, but not most Americans. But if somebody who got up and said we should have a king, they would be charged with being un-American.
I think what drives a lot of debate within American politics and society is Americans' commitment to the twin ideals of freedom and liberty. And I think Americans would not have such hotly debated discourses on, say, wealth inequality or racial inequality had not been for the ideals enshrined in the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal. And I think the similar thing goes with Americans' commitment to freedom, especially when it comes to its foreign policy interest to advance the cause of freedom in other countries. You wouldn't see the same commitment to equality, for example, in India, even after they formally abolished the caste system, or the same commitment to freedom in less democratic countries. So how would you observe this tension inherent between freedom and equality in America?
Tension between freedom and equality?
Yes.
Yes, of course. For the French, it was easy to say liberty, equality, fraternity, right? Well, there is a tension in the way. It's an interesting way Americans tend to resolve it. So you start off with a sort of, let's say, relatively crude notion of freedom. Everybody can do whatever they want as long as they don't hurt anybody else. And then you have the idea that, well, we believe in equality and not only equality at birth, you might say, in terms of all men are created equal, but some sense of equality generally. But then you get these contradictions in a society of a great deal of individual freedom. You get these growing inequalities, and that's a tension in the United States. How do Americans resolve that tension? Because some solutions to that tension would be to curb the freedom of individuals on behalf of creating greater equality, and that shows up in everything from, let's say, the tax system. We're going to use the tax system to take money away from the successful and give them to the less successful in pursuit of this other goal. And so we are obviously constraining the equality of the freedom, constraining the freedom of actors to be as rich as they want. And you can talk about that in other forms as well, the balance between freedom and equality. So I would say for mainstream Americans, and I've written a little bit about this, the resolution is the emphasis on the equality of opportunity. Most Americans would say, yes, inequality is terrible. And in fact, Americans do complain about economic inequality. I should say, just parenthetically, political equality is assumed. Everybody has one vote. That's not debated. But economic inequality is is something Americans do object to, but their favorite solution to this is equality of opportunity. And the idea that every child should have the same chance as every other child to succeed. Now, it turns out from a sociologist's point of view, this is not a realistic resolution because you can create the greatest equality of opportunity, like you create a totally free and open foot race. But that won't change the fact that at the end of the race, some people will be far ahead and some people will be far behind. But Americans do think about this in terms, for better for worse, that well, what we should do is provide more educational opportunities, for example, so that children from a disadvantaged background get the education necessary to compete, and they're not disadvantaged by their background. When you start to move to solutions that involve the constraint of freedom, like putting a cap on incomes, then Americans balk at this. Even Americans who make little money would think that the idea that nobody should be allowed to be a billionaire would offend them. They may never become a billionaire, but they want to have the fantasy that if they could become a billionaire, they could keep their billions. So this is a continuing tension, and as I said, the way Americans tend to deal with the tension between absolute freedom and absolute equality as principles is to try to walk this line about equal opportunity.
So as you've alluded to earlier in this talk, Americans are optimistic about, well, their country in general, but pessimistic about the particulars, like where the American government is heading or what America is doing abroad, et cetera, et cetera. And I find it to be, well, something that makes America exceptional. For example, if you compare, say, the national anthem of Poland, it starts with "Poland has not yet perished," which is a bittersweet notion to invoke. But you wouldn't find a line in the Star Spangled Banner that says "America has not yet perished." The song calls your country "Land of the Free and Home of the Brave." So I wonder if Americans' optimism specifically in its adherence to the twin ideals of freedom and equality, has it worked in America's favor?
Well, let's separate the long picture from the contemporary picture, and I think the ideology, you might say the myth of the American dream. Anybody could grow up to have a house with a white picket fence. Indeed, anybody could grow up to be president of the United States. To such academics have made lifetime careers showing how the discrepancy between that mythology and reality. And I don't think you have to spend a whole career doing that. I mean, it's quite clear. But the existence of the ideology and the mythology, I think, could be argued has its own consequences, which are to encourage taking risks, encourage in the business side entrepreneurship, encourage getting more education, encourage people to come here. The reality may be very often disappointing, but if the myth is that the United States is a place with many more chances than Poland, then you get some of the best and the brightest of Poland coming to the United States. And that's worked to America's advantage. One of the striking things about the contemporary period is the rise since roughly 1970 of discontent, disappointment, disillusionment with American institutions. And there's been a long effort to try to figure out what this is about. And the answers range from, for example, the loss of innocence. 1972 is often pointed to as a critical year. This was Richard Nixon was reelected, and then by 1976 he was impeached. Would have been impeached. He had to resign. The whole scandal of the Watergate sort of revealed a sordid underbelly. And then there was the Vietnam War, which ended up being extremely divisive and disappointing in its results. And so one analysis is, this is what we've seen, is that innocent Americans who just accepted the sort of facade, everything is wonderful, everything is the best, were disillusioned by historical events. You could also go back to the assassinations of John Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy. Another analysis is economic, that the great bountiful optimism of America coincided with the post-World War II years, in which the United States was just about the only economy in the world still standing. And those were economically boom times for Americans and their children. And that by the time you turn into the 1970s and 80s, you turn into a more contested economic world and more difficult. And the growth rate of American income starts to slow down, especially American middle class and workers. So that this is economic disillusionment, you might say. So those are a couple of the explanations, but it's quite clear there's a difference. If you look at those indicators, optimism about the country, and you compare 2023 to 1953 or 1963, there's a big difference on the side of disillusionment and discontent.
Now, I'm reminded of the two works by the great historian Richard Hofstadter, Anti-Intellectualism in American Life and the Paranoid Style of American Politics, both of which it's surprisingly very relevant in this age when it comes to, I would say, describing more the American right at the moment with their skepticism of, vaccines and Dr. Fauci and the conspiracies about the stolen election and all that. But I wonder if this hyper conspiratorial thinking and anti-intellectual thinking stems from their core beliefs that that they are equal to those who rule over them. So they have the right or the freedom to dissent to the intellectuals, only they've taken this notion to an undesirable extreme.
Yeah, I think it is. I think you're right. I think it is rooted. I mean, there's certain aspects of the contemporary situation that are distinctive, but I think many observers have noted, not just Hofstadter, but others, and they've noted this over the years, going back to the early 19th century, the extent to which part of this all men are created equal ideology, which goes again with the idea that all people should encounter God on their own, should read the Bible and make their own decisions. This kind of individualism has been tied in American history with anti-authoritarianism, anti-elitism, anti-statism, and which boils down in a sort of mundane way to the idea that nobody knows more than anybody else. Or let's put it another way, any American's opinions are as good as any other American's opinions. And just because you have a PhD, or just because you're rich, or just because you've been appointed by the president to some position, doesn't mean you really know any better than anybody else. And if people do their own research, quote unquote, this is a phrase among conspiracy theorists, do your own research, you can come up with your own ideas. And there are long ago historical antecedents. America was well known for the fluorescence of all sorts of religious sects, most of which have disappeared to historical view, but the Mormon Church is an example. This grew out of a sort of idiosyncratic family that invented their own religion, and survived repression, and unlike the other sects, has thrived. But it's the same idea that it's one side of egalitarianism. So there's a lot more skepticism here about experts of any kind. And you compare that, for instance, an example on the other side that comes to my mind is the French system, in which all the technological universities are given high prestige, and the political leaders often come out of these technical training institutions, in which the idea is that these are people who have all this technical knowledge, and they should basically control things, and it goes along with sort of superior cultural knowledge. That's very foreign to the American sensibility, in which the idea is, nobody, you don't flash your credentials in the United States and expect to get respected, and say, oh, I'm a PhD, you should listen to me. I mean, you're just as likely to get a hostile reaction to that. Who says you know more than I do?
Yes, I'm reminded of William F. Buckley Jr. when he says, I would rather have the first 200 names in the phone book to govern me than the entire faculty of Harvard.
Right, and that kind of praise of the I forgot what the term is. It's in a Copeland, Aaron Copeland musical piece, but the praise of the common folk is very common and very profound, and it's a typical politician's line. He will go to some place and say, well, you folks know, these pointy-headed intellectuals back, or these pointy-headed bureaucrats back in Washington, they don't really know. You, the plain people, you know what's real. That flatters that same sensibility that anybody can be an expert in anything.
Yes, and I certainly believe that populism, as much as it manifests itself in other countries nowadays in Europe, there's a distinct American character about like populist movements, from Bryan to obviously Trump, and it espouses this notion that the people, or the majority, or the people who support the populist candidate knows best, and it is the intellectuals and the elites who have left you behind.
Yeah, you may have a better sense than I do how odd that might look from an international perspective, but no politician has failed to try to use that idea. I mean, flattering your audiences with is very common. And by the way, this was one of the things that was perceived to be a problem with Obama. He was unable to hide the way some others have been able to hide his elite background, his education at Columbia, his Harvard law degree. People gathered the sense that he thought himself smarter than everybody else. And there was that famous comment he made in the first campaign, I think it was, about people who cling to their guns and their religion as examples of the ignorant. So he was a sort of a negative marker in that way. He was never, he did not sing the populist song very well.
Yes, he did have to go off his way to be a community organizer in Chicago, but that didn't help him too much.
No, because that actually, I would say, for most Americans, that was a questionable credential, because it wasn't that he rose from that community. He parachuted in from Harvard, and he was going to uplift people. Well, that whole thing sounds, and for people on the right, he was going to be a troublemaker. But even for middle Americans, it might show that his heart is in the right place, that he cared but it actually was part of a portfolio of, working for a fancy law firm, getting a Harvard law degree, reading all these fancy books, making allusions to esoteric stuff. Joe Biden doesn't operate that way, you'll note.
Yes. So final question.
Yeah.
So if you were to revise this book now, what would you add and or omit?
Well, the simplest thing I would do, I don't know if I would go in and change, paragraph by paragraph, but that book was finished basically in 2009, just about the time Obama took the presidency. We're now 14 years later, and the United States has suffered a great recession. The economic effects of that recession have been serious and long-lasting, and then has suffered this extreme political polarization, which started under Obama, but was harnessed by Trump, and has really pervaded much of the society, this sort of polarization between the sides. And I would probably write a short chapter about whether some of the trends that I talk about in the main part of the book have either receded or crested or plateaued. So, for example, chapter 2 of Made in America is about the rising security of everyday life in America from the 17th century to the end of the 20th century. And I make an argument there that increasing security, meaning your physical safety and your economic security, underlay a lot of social developments in America and allowed people, for instance, to plan their futures in ways that was not possible in earlier eras. Well, you could make an argument that the last 20 years or so of American history, that security has been shaken. The most dramatic example of this, or the most dramatic indicator of this, is that death rates in the United States have plateaued and have started to increase. And Americans' lifespans, which used to be the highest in the Western world, are now the lowest in the Western world. And there's a serious problem of early death in America, which is the opposite of what, a greater security in life, that's the greater insecurity. So did we sort of reach a point around 2000 where some of the trends I described had sort of reached their summit, and we're now on some kind of perhaps only temporary decline? And security would be one. I would write about that is, to what extent has economic and physical security for Americans been shaken from that happy trend that we saw for most of 300 years. So that's the kind of thing I might do.
On that note, thank you very much, Professor Claude Fischer of UC Berkeley, for joining this program.
Thank you. Very good questions.